The gun went off before Marcella Carter even had time to scream. She stood frozen in the middle of Caldwell Street, the hot August dust swirling around her boots, her heart hammering so violently against her ribs she thought the whole town of Redemption, Kansas, must have been able to hear it. The shot had not been aimed at her. It had been aimed at the man standing 3 feet to her left, and it had missed by inches that she could not afford to count. The smell of gunpowder scorched her nose. The crowd that had gathered outside the cattlemen's bank scattered like startled birds, women pulling their skirts and children to their chests, men pressing flat against the wooden storefronts as if they could melt into the painted boards. And then the silence came, that terrible, suspended silence that always followed violence in this town. Marcella did not run. She never ran. Running attracted attention, and for 3 years she had been very, very careful not to attract a single soul's attention in Redemption. She was invisible here. She had made herself invisible, deliberately, methodically, like a woman who understood that being seen meant being found. It was the only way she had survived since she crossed the state line into Kansas with 30 cents to her name, a forged letter of employment, and a secret that could get her killed. But then the dust cleared, and he looked up. He was standing across the street, tall and broad-shouldered under a sun-bleached canvas coat, one hand still resting on the hitching post where his bay horse stood tethered. He should have been looking at the gunman. Every other eye in Redemption was locked on the man with the smoking pistol being wrestled to the ground by Deputy Greer. But Edgar Fletcher was not looking at the gunman. He was looking directly at Marcella, and he smiled, not a polite smile. Not the distant, performative nod that men of his standing offered to women of her station as a social courtesy. This was something else entirely. It was a smile of recognition, as though he had been searching for her in a crowded room and had finally, after a very long time, found her. Marcella's blood went cold, because no one was supposed to find her. Not here. Not ever. She turned and walked away as steadily as her legs would carry her, and she did not look back. She had 3 years of practice at disappearing. She told herself it would be enough. She was wrong. To understand why that smile shattered Marcella Carter's carefully constructed world, you have to go back to how she came to be standing on that dusty street in the first place. Invisible and terrified and alive in a town she had never meant to stay in for more than a season. She had been born in St. Louis, Missouri, in 1857, the third daughter of a moderately prosperous dry goods merchant who had believed that women served 2 purposes in the world: decorating a household and producing heirs for men who could afford to keep them. Marcella had failed spectacularly at both ambitions. She was not beautiful in the conventional way of St. Louis drawing rooms. She was not small or delicate or particularly interested in performing smallness or delicacy. She was tall for a woman, with dark eyes that missed nothing and hands that had never quite lost the ink stains from the books she read compulsively when her father was not watching. What Marcella Carter was clever. And in 1875 Missouri, cleverness in a woman was considered slightly more problematic than an outbreak of cholera. She had worked for 3 years as a bookkeeper for her father's business, a fact he had carefully concealed from his business associates by giving her the unofficial title of household secretary, which meant nothing and cost him nothing, and allowed him to use her mathematical gift without crediting it. She had discovered, at age 20, that the man her father had promised her to in marriage, a banker named Theodore Holt, had a dark past that stretched from Memphis to St. Louis in a trail of broken women and buried rumors. Theodore Holt did not merely have a temper. Theodore Holt had buried a wife in Memphis in 1873, and the manner of that burial had been too convenient and too quiet for Marcella's relentless, ink-stained mind to accept. She had tried to tell her father. Her father had told her that she was imaginative to the point of hysterics, and that the wedding would proceed in March. So Marcella Carter had done the only logical thing. She had stolen $300 from Theodore Holt's private account in the St. Louis Mercantile Bank, a place where she had discovered, through the very bookkeeping skills her father pretended she didn't possess, that Holt kept a secondary ledger under a false name. She had taken the money, which she calculated was modest compensation for the considerable risk he had made her take simply by existing near him. She had boarded a westbound train in February of 1878. She had gotten off in Redemption, Kansas, because her money had run out, and because the town was small enough and far enough west that she reasoned no one would think to look for a runaway bookkeeper's daughter there. She had reasoned correctly. For 3 years, she had been invisible. She had found work at Howell's General Store, where the owner, a portly and largely incurious man named Samuel Howell, needed someone to manage his accounts and did not ask too many questions as long as the numbers balanced and the coffee was hot. She had rented a small room above the harness maker's shop on the east end of Caldwell Street for $4 a month. She had learned to dress in colors that did not stand out and to keep her voice low and her gaze down, and to make herself a piece of furniture in any room she entered. She had become so thoroughly unremarkable that she sometimes frightened herself. And then Edgar Fletcher had looked up and smiled, and the whole careful architecture of her invisible life had begun, without warning or mercy, to crack. She spent the evening after the shooting sitting at the narrow desk in her room above the harness shop, staring at the column of numbers she was supposed to be adding for Samuel Howell's quarterly accounts, and adding them wrong 3 times in a row. Outside, Redemption settled into the sounds of its evening routine, men shouting across the street to one another, the piano at the Silver Spur Saloon starting up its nightly racket, a dog barking somewhere near the livery stable. Marcella pressed her fingertips to her temples and breathed. She told herself the smile had meant nothing, that Edgar Fletcher was simply a man who smiled at women on the street the way other men tipped their hats, reflexively, without intention. She told herself she had been startled by the gunshot and her nerves had made her imagine a significance that wasn't there. But she knew herself too well to sustain that particular lie. She had seen Edgar Fletcher around Redemption for all 3 years she had lived there. It was impossible not to. He was the second largest landowner in Comanche County, with a cattle ranch called the 3 Bar that sprawled across 11,000 acres of golden Kansas grassland east of town. He rode into Redemption 2 or 3 times a week for supplies or business, tall in the saddle on that same bay horse, and he was the kind of man that a town naturally organized itself around without entirely meaning to. Not because he was arrogant. In fact, Marcella had specifically noted, with the precision of someone cataloging threats, that Edgar Fletcher was conspicuously lacking in arrogance for a man of his standing. He was 32 years old, brown-haired and broad-shouldered, with a face that spent too much time in the Kansas sun, and a way of listening to people that made them feel, apparently, that he had all the time in the world for whatever they needed to say. He was universally liked. He was trusted. The Redemption County Commissioner, a wiry man named Aldous Briggs, deferred to him on land matters. The Reverend Stoddard had once, in a Sunday sermon that Marcella had attended from the back pew, used the phrase "a man of upright character" in what was transparently obvious reference to Edgar Fletcher sitting in the 3rd row. Women looked at him. Men shook his hand with both of theirs. And in 3 years he had never once looked at Marcella Carter. Until today. She added the column wrong a 4th time and put her pencil down. She was being irrational. The smile was nothing. Tomorrow she would walk past him on the street if she had to, and she would keep her gaze down the way she always did, and she would be invisible, and that would be the end of it. The next morning arrived with a sky the color of hammered copper and a wind off the plains that smelled like rain that was still 2 days away. Marcella dressed in her usual brown calico and pinned her dark hair back with the same severity she applied to everything in her life. She ate the small breakfast she always ate, cornbread left from the night before and black coffee she made herself on the small iron stove in the corner of her room. She went down to Howell's General Store at precisely 7:45, which was when she always arrived. Samuel Howell was behind the counter sorting a delivery of tinned goods and barely looked up when she came in. The door had been open for business for exactly 14 minutes, and already 3 people had come and gone. Marcella settled onto her stool behind the narrow desk in the back corner where she kept Howell's accounts, and she breathed, and she was invisible. She was invisible for almost 40 minutes. Then the bell above the door rang and Edgar Fletcher walked in. He was alone, which was slightly unusual. He often came in with one of his ranch hands, a man named Pete Ochoa, who did most of the heavy carrying while Edgar conducted his business with Samuel. Today he came in alone, holding his hat in his hand in the way men did when they were trying to signal that they meant to be civil. "Morning, Sam," he said, his voice carrying the easy depth of a man who did not need to raise it to be heard. "Morning, Edgar." Samuel Howell looked up from his tinned goods with the particular brightness he reserved for customers who spent more than most. "What can I do for you today?" "Need to settle last month's account," Edgar said, "and I wanted to speak with your bookkeeper if she has a moment." Marcella's pencil stopped moving. The silence that followed felt approximately 1,000 years long. "My bookkeeper?" Samuel looked confused for exactly a moment, then glanced toward the back corner where Marcella sat so still she might have been a piece of furniture. "You mean Miss Carter?" "She handles the accounts, but she's not much for, I don't know what you'd need with." "If it's not any trouble," Edgar said, and he was already looking toward the back corner, and Marcella realized with a slow, terrible certainty that she had nowhere to go. She set her pencil down. She stood. She walked to the front of the store with the measured calm of a woman walking to her own execution, because in 3 years she had learned that dignity was the one thing you could hold onto when everything else was already lost. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, and her voice did not shake, which she considered a personal triumph under the circumstances. He smiled again. That same smile. Up close it was worse, because up close she could see that it was not a calculated smile at all. It was a smile of genuine, uncomplicated pleasure, as if seeing her had simply made his morning better, and that straightforward sincerity was somehow the most disarming thing she had ever encountered. "Miss Carter," he said, "I apologize for interrupting your work. I have a proposition if you're willing to hear it." Behind him, Samuel Howell was watching with undisguised curiosity. Marcella made a decision. "Perhaps outside," she said. They stood on the boardwalk in front of Howell's General Store in the copper morning light, and Edgar Fletcher explained his proposition with the direct, unhurried plainness of a man who had thought carefully about what he wanted to say. The 3-Bar Ranch had been running its accounts by hand in a system that his late father had established in 1863, a system that involved 3 separate ledger books, a method of tracking cattle numbers that Edgar described as deeply confused, and a habit of keeping certain payments in what he called the second tin box under the office floorboard, which was not a bookkeeping system so much as it was a prayer. His regular man of business, a fellow named Davis who came up from Wichita twice a year, had recently informed him that the state of the 3 Bars accounts was approaching what Davis had diplomatically called a condition requiring professional intervention. Edgar had asked around about bookkeepers. 3 people, entirely independently, had told him to speak to Samuel Howell's quiet girl in the back. Marcella stood very still and listened to all of this and tried to determine whether it was a trap. She had spent 3 years being suspicious of anything that felt like opportunity, because opportunity had always been the thing that preceded catastrophe in her experience. But as she watched Edgar Fletcher explain his accounting crisis with an expression of genuine, slightly self-deprecating embarrassment about the tin box under the floorboard, she could not locate the hidden motive. He was not watching her the way Theodore Holt had watched her. He was not performing charm. He was simply standing in the morning light, hat in hand, asking her to help him with a problem she was genuinely qualified to solve. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "that I charge $6 a week for accounting work. That is not negotiable." "That seems entirely fair," he said, without hesitation. "I should also tell you that I keep my own hours and my own methods, and I don't work well with interference." "I wouldn't know anything about accounting methods to interfere with," he said. "That's rather the problem." Something inside Marcella's chest shifted, not dramatically. Just a small, precise shift, like a door that has been held shut for a very long time moving a fraction of an inch on its hinges. "I'll need to see the ledgers before I agree," she said. "Of course," he said. "Come out to the 3 bar whenever you're ready. Ask Pete Ochoa to take you to me if I'm out on the range." He put his hat back on. He tipped it at her, which was a thing people did, but he did it with a quality of attention that made it feel different from the routine social gesture it technically was. He went back inside to settle his account with Samuel, and Marcella stood on the boardwalk in the copper morning light and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like something other than furniture. It terrified her completely. She spent 2 days negotiating with herself. She made arguments on both sides with the thoroughness of someone who had once been very good at debate before life had taught her to keep her arguments internal. The case for taking the job was straightforward. $6 a week was more than she currently earned from Samuel, and the 3 bar's chaotic accounts sounded like the kind of problem she would find genuinely satisfying to solve. The case against taking the job was also straightforward. Getting close to anyone in redemption was a risk she could not afford, and getting close to the most prominent, most observed man in Comanche County was a risk so spectacular it barely needed articulating. But on the 3rd morning she found herself saddling the livery stable's oldest and most trustworthy horse, a gray mare named Biscuit whom the stableman rented out for 50 cents, and riding east out of Redemption on the road that crossed the Cimarron Creek and continued through the tall grass toward the distant dark line of fence posts that marked the beginning of 3 bar land. She told herself she was being practical. The 3 bar was not what she had expected, which was saying something because Marcella Carter had disciplined herself against forming expectations. She had imagined a working ranch, which it certainly was, with the smell and sound of cattle evident from a quarter-mile out, and the constant movement of men and horses that characterized any large operation. But the house at the center of it surprised her. It was a long, low structure of pale Kansas limestone, built solid and deep-rooted into the prairie, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front face and windows that were larger than they needed to be, as if whoever had designed it had understood that people needed to be able to see the sky. Edgar's father, she would learn later, had come from Vermont. He had built the house in 1861 with the specific intention of making it a thing that lasted, and it had. Pete Ochoa, a compact Mexican man in his 40s with a face like weathered saddle leather and eyes that assessed everything calmly and catalogued it away for later consideration, was working a chestnut colt in the round pen when she arrived. He looked at Marcella, then at the gray mare, then back at Marcella with an expression that said he had already formed a complete opinion about the situation and would keep it to himself. "Mr. Fletcher is in the east pasture," he said. "I'll send a boy." "I can wait," Marcella said. She waited on the porch, which faced southeast over a long view of grass that went on until it met the sky in a perfectly level line. The wind moved through it in visible waves, and the light of mid-morning turned it all to gold and green in alternating pulses. Despite herself, despite everything, Marcella found it beautiful. She was sitting on the porch steps with her leather satchel across her knees when Edgar came up from the east pasture on his bay horse, moving at an easy trot that slowed to a walk as he came through the gate. He had his coat off and his sleeves rolled up, and there was red Kansas dust on his boots and his hatband. He looked, she thought, like a man in his natural element, and there was something steady about him, some quality of groundedness that she had not given herself permission to notice from a safe distance on Caldwell Street. "Miss Carter," he said, and swung down from the horse in the unhurried way of men who had done that particular movement 10,000 times. "I wasn't certain you'd come." "I said I would consider it," she said. "I have considered it. And I'll look at the ledgers first." He smiled and led her inside. The office was off the main room of the house, a narrow room lined with shelves that held everything from seed catalogs to a cracked leather-bound Bible to a collection of arrowheads that someone had organized with more care than the accounting ledgers. The desk was wide and scarred with decades of use, and on it sat the 3 ledger books he had mentioned, none of which appeared to have been opened with any particular enthusiasm. Marcella sat down, opened the first one, and did not speak for 20 minutes. Edgar brought her coffee, which she accepted without looking up. He stood behind her for approximately 30 seconds, which was how long it took him to realize that when Marcella Carter was working, she had no awareness of anything else in the room, and then he went quietly away and left her to it. When she finally looked up, she found him sitting in the armchair across the room reading a periodical, so completely at ease with her silence that she felt a small, unwilling relaxation of the vigilance she maintained in close quarters with people she did not trust. "This is chaos," she told him. "I know," he said. "Your father tracked cattle purchases here, here, and here." She indicated 3 different sections of the second ledger, but he stopped cross-referencing them in 1872, which means you have been operating for 7 years without accurate numbers for your annual inventory. "Also something I suspected but could not confirm," he said. "You have a surplus in the bank account that I can identify, but I can also see evidence of at least 3 payments made under names I don't recognize, which may indicate additional creditors that weren't properly recorded." He was quiet for a moment. "How bad is that?" "It depends on what the payments were for. They may be perfectly legitimate." She paused. "Do you have any enemies, Mr. Fletcher?" He looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was in the neighborhood of it. "Most men of any consequence have someone who dislikes them," he said carefully. "Do you have anyone who might use your accounting confusion to make a claim against the ranch that you could not defend with accurate records?" The quality of his stillness changed. It became the stillness of a man who has just understood that the woman in front of him is not merely a bookkeeper but a person who thinks in terms of danger, and who was asking him a question from experience. "There's a man named Harlan Cross," he said slowly. "He owns the Broken Spur, which runs adjacent to my north border. He's been pushing on the fence line for 2 years, trying to get an extra 50 acres on the water side." Marcella looked at the ledger. "What are these 3 payments marked to H.C. Grazing Rights, 1879? Edgar stood up from his chair and came to the desk and looked where she was pointing, and the expression that crossed his face was one she recognized from her own reflection. It was the expression of someone who has just seen a hidden motive become visible. "I never authorized any grazing rights payment to Harlan Cross," he said. "Then someone else did," Marcella said, "and they signed it with your initial." 2 weeks later she was at the 3 bar 4 days a week, arriving at 8 in the morning and leaving at 4 in the afternoon, working through the accumulated chaos of 17 years of neglected records with the focused, quiet intensity of a surgeon. She rebuilt the inventory ledgers from scratch, cross-referencing cattle purchase records against brand registrations at the county office, where the clerk, a thin young man named Garfield, was so startled by the precision of her questions that he developed a slightly reverent attitude toward her that she found faintly embarrassing. The fraudulent grazing payments were, as she had suspected, the work of someone with access to the 3 bars accounts. She tracked them carefully, documenting each entry in the new system she was building, laying out the pattern of dates and amounts with the methodical patience of someone constructing a case rather than simply balancing books. She said nothing about what she was finding until she was certain. During those 2 weeks, Edgar Fletcher stayed out of her way with a consideration that she found both professionally courteous and, in some corner of herself, she was not ready to examine, quietly touching. He was present in the house or near it during the hours she worked, and he appeared briefly at the desk twice each day. Once in the morning when he brought coffee he had learned she took black with no sugar, and once in the late afternoon when he would stand in the doorway of the office and ask, without any specific urgency, whether she needed anything else. When she said no, he said good and left her to it. On a Tuesday afternoon in the third week, he arrived in the doorway at his usual time to find her sitting back in the chair with her hands folded on top of the closed ledger, and a look on her face that he apparently understood immediately, because he came in without being invited and sat down across the desk. "Tell me," he said. "The payments to Harlan Cross's grazing rights total $460 over 3 years," she said. "They were made in the first week of every third month, which is regular enough to look like a standing arrangement. The signature on each one is yours, but the handwriting on the entries around them is different from your entries elsewhere in the ledger. Someone copied your initial signature and made entries in a hand they deliberately tried to make neutral. Who had access to this office? That is the question," she said. "I can tell you when the entries were made based on where they fall relative to other dated entries. The first one was February of 1879. Who had access to this office in early 1879 who does not have it now?" He was quiet for a long moment. A quality of controlled anger had entered the room, the kind of anger that had been disciplined by a man who understood that fury without direction was useless. "My foreman before Pete Ochoa," he said. "A man named Gideon Marsh. He left the 3 Bar in the summer of 1879 under circumstances I was never fully satisfied with. Claimed he was moving back to Oklahoma, but Pete heard from someone in Dodge City that he was working for Cross." Marcella had expected that the revelation of a betrayal this significant might produce in Edgar Fletcher some of the destabilizing anger she had observed in other men of power when confronted with the evidence of treachery. She had been cautiously prepared for it, had organized her documentation with the specific intention of providing him something concrete to look at rather than just her words to react to, because she had learned that men in the grip of fury were less likely to doubt what they could see with their own eyes. She had not been prepared for the way he looked at her instead of the ledger. "How did you know to look for this?" he asked, not accusingly, with something that was closer to wonder. She hesitated. In 3 years, she had not told anyone in redemption the truth of why she was there, or where she had come from. She had given Samuel Howell a version that was mostly true, that she had trained as a bookkeeper in St. Louis and had come west looking for work, which was accurate in its broad strokes if not in its specifics. But Edgar Fletcher was asking her something different. He was asking not what she knew but how she had learned to look for it, and that question had a real answer, and the real answer was dangerous. "I have experience with men who use financial records as a weapon," she said, which was true. He studied her for a moment. Then he nodded without pressing further and looked down at the ledger. "What do we do with this?" he asked. "We take it to Sheriff Amos," she said. "We have the documentation. The handwriting discrepancy alone should be enough to open an investigation, and if Gideon Marsh is working for Harlan Cross, that's a conspiracy to defraud." Edgar nodded slowly. "All right," he said. Then, after a pause, "Thank you, Miss Carter." There was something in the way he said it that made the habitual armor she wore feel, for just a moment, insufficient for the moment. Not because it was effusive, it was not. It was said simply, directly, as one person says something true to another person they respect. And Marcella Carter had not been spoken to like a person she did not need to be suspicious of in so long that she sat with it for a moment after he left the room, turning it over carefully, looking at it from all sides the way she looked at numbers, trying to find the catch. She could not find one. She told herself that was probably the most alarming sign yet. They went to Sheriff Amos Griggs together on a Thursday morning, which was Edgar's idea. He had asked if she would come, saying that her ability to explain the accounting evidence was considerably superior to his own. She had said yes, which she examined afterward for several hours as evidence that her judgment was deteriorating. Sheriff Griggs was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a white mustache and the permanently tired eyes of someone who had been enforcing the law in a cattle county since before most of his deputies were born. He listened to Marcella lay out the evidence with the methodical clarity she brought to everything, and he looked at the copies she had made of the fraudulent entries, and he rubbed his white mustache. Harlan Cross is going to say Gideon Marsh acted alone and without his knowledge, he said. Of course he is, Marcella said. That's why we need Marsh. Griggs looked at her, then at Edgar. Where'd you find her? He said in a tone that was not unkind. She found me, Edgar said, and when Marcella glanced at him she found that the smile was there again, that quiet, direct, entirely unsettling smile, and she looked back at Griggs with considerable haste. The investigation proceeded over the following month with the grinding patience of frontier justice, which was slower and more uncertain than the justice in the novels Marcella had read, but also, she was learning, more real. Sheriff Griggs sent a deputy to Dodge City. The deputy came back with word that Gideon Marsh was not in Dodge City, but was rumored to be in Wichita. Griggs sent a telegram to the Wichita Sheriff's Office. The Wichita Sheriff's Office responded after 10 days, confirming that a man of Marsh's description had been working at a stockyard operation with known connections to Harlan Cross's cattle interests. Meanwhile, Marcella continued her work on the 3 bars accounts. The immediate crisis of the fraudulent entries had been documented and handed to the law, but there was still the larger project of the chaotic ledgers, and she had become genuinely absorbed in it in the way she became absorbed in any complex problem. She had always known, constitutionally incapable of doing something halfway. It was during this month that the shape of her days began to shift in ways she did not immediately account for. She noticed, approximately 2 weeks into the investigation period, that she had stopped dreading the ride out to the 3 bar in the mornings. She noticed, a few days after that she had begun to look forward to the morning coffee Edgar brought to the office door, not because she needed the coffee, but because of the 2 or 3 minutes of conversation that came with it. They talked about the accounts, usually, and about the investigation's progress, but increasingly about other things. The cattle market. A piece she had read in the Dodge City Times about the railroad's expansion into the southern part of the county. A disagreement she had with Samuel Howell about his credit terms that Edgar had found genuinely funny, which had surprised her because she had not expected to make anyone laugh. She was very cautious about these conversations. She kept them short and practical, and she did not allow herself to follow any of them into territory that might require her to say something true about herself. But she could not, with complete honesty, pretend they were nothing. Edgar Fletcher, she was discovering in spite of herself, was a man of unexpected depths. He was not the uncomplicated civic paragon that Redemption's collective regard for him had suggested. He had a precise, skeptical mind that he wore lightly, as though he had learned somewhere along the way that people were more comfortable when intelligence didn't announce itself. He had complicated feelings about his father, who had built the house to last, and also left behind a set of accounting ledgers so thoroughly confused that they had become essentially a monument to avoidance. He had a sense of humor that appeared without warning and then disappeared back into straightforwardness so quickly you almost doubted you had seen it. He had been married once. She learned this from Pete Ochoa's wife, a warm-voiced woman named Rosa who came twice a week to cook and clean at the ranch house, and who had developed, over the preceding weeks, a habit of bringing Marcella extra biscuits at mid-morning and chatting with her in the easy, comfortable way of women who have decided they approve of each other. His wife's name was Clara, Rosa said, without any particular preamble, on a Wednesday morning when Marcella was eating her biscuit and Rosa was sweeping the office doorway. She died in the winter of 1877, the fever. She was 23. Marcella set her biscuit down. He doesn't talk about it much, Rosa continued, in the tone of someone who is technically only sweeping. But you can see it when he doesn't think anyone is watching, something careful in him. Marcella thought about something careful in a person, and she looked at the numbers in the ledger in front of her without seeing them for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Rosa looked up from her sweeping with eyes that held a specific, affectionate directness. "Because you are also someone who is very careful," she said. "And I think careful people sometimes need someone to tell them that the thing they are being careful about is safe." Marcella spent the rest of that day being professionally efficient and thinking about nothing else. October came in cold and clean, with frosts that turned the grass to silver every morning and burned off by 10. The sky over Comanche County went the hard, clear blue of autumn, and the cattle on the 3 bar moved differently in the cold air, more alert, their breath coming in small white clouds. Marcella had taken to wearing her heavier wool coat for the ride out, and had started bringing an extra blanket for Biscuit, who was old enough to deserve the consideration. It was on a Tuesday in the second week of October that things came to a head in ways she had not predicted. She was at her desk in the office when she heard voices in the main room, louder than usual and carrying an edge of confrontation. She recognized Edgar's voice and one other, a heavier voice, rougher, with the particular quality of a man who was accustomed to using volume as a proxy for authority. She sat still for a moment, then she got up and stood in the office doorway. Harlan Cross was a big man, thickening in the middle the way prosperous men did, with a red face that suggested either strong drink or strong emotion, and at this particular moment it was clearly both. He was standing in Edgar's main room with his hat still on, which was a deliberate rudeness, and he was pointing a finger at Edgar in the way of a man who had decided that aggression was his best available defense. "I want those allegations withdrawn," Cross said. "You send your people sniffing through my operations. You send telegrams to Wichita making accusations against men in my employ, and I will see you in front of a judge before the month is out." "I haven't made any accusations," Edgar said. He was standing with his arms at his sides, and his voice was very level. "I've given Sheriff Griggs documentation of fraudulent entries in my own accounts. What he does with that is his business. Marsh never worked for me in any capacity that would—" "Marsh is in Wichita," Edgar said, "with a Wichita attorney as of yesterday morning. I imagine what he has to say to that attorney is going to be relevant to your position." Cross went a darker shade of red. His eyes moved from Edgar, swept across the room, and landed on Marcella standing in the office doorway. "That's her," he said, and his voice dropped to a register that was more alarming than the shouting had been. "That's the one who went through your books." "Miss Carter is my bookkeeper," Edgar said. "Your bookkeeper." Cross said it like he was tasting something unpleasant. "Convenient that you found one willing to build a case against your neighbors out of bookkeeping." "The entries were fraudulent," Marcella said. Her voice was steady. She had long practice at keeping her voice steady under threat. "The documentation is accurate. What they were used for is a matter for Sheriff Griggs." Cross looked at her for a long, measuring moment with the specific expression of a man, deciding whether she was a problem he needed to solve directly. She had seen that expression before. On Theodore Holt's face, in a drawing room in St. Louis 7 years ago. The memory of it ran like cold water along her spine. But Edgar had stepped forward just slightly, and his body was angled in a way that put him between Marcella and Cross without being dramatic about it. "You know the way out, Harlan," he said. Cross left. The sound of his horse on the hard ground faded south toward the fence line, and then the kitchen resumed its small sounds and the wind moved against the windows, and Marcella became aware that her hands, which she had been holding very still, were trembling slightly. Edgar turned from the door. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, because he was looking at her with the same quality of precise attention he always brought to things, and she felt suddenly very exposed in the office doorway, she said, "He's going to try to find something to use against me." Edgar was quiet for a moment. Why would he think there's something to find? She met his eyes, and the moment stretched, and she made the decision that she had been refusing to make for 6 weeks. "Because there is," she said. They sat on the porch in the thin October sun, and Marcella Carter told Edgar Fletcher the truth for the first time in 3 years. She told it the way she told a complicated set of numbers, completely and in the correct sequence, without editorializing, and without softening the parts that reflected badly on herself. She told him about her father's business and Theodore Holt and the buried wife in Memphis. She told him about the $300 she had taken from Holt's account, which she described accurately as theft, because she did not intend to mitigate it even though she believed it had been justified. She told him about the train west and the 30 cents at the end of the line and redemption, and 3 years of invisibility. She told him all of it, and when she was done, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked out at the long view of grass and waited. "Do you believe he killed his first wife?" Edgar asked. She had expected questions about the money. The directness of what he had actually asked stopped her for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I couldn't prove it, I still can't, but yes." He was quiet. The wind moved through the grass in its visible wave. "The $300, he said. "Do you regret taking it?" She considered this with more honesty than the question might have required. "I regret that it was necessary," she said. "I don't regret doing it." He nodded slowly. "Holt. You know if he ever came looking?" "I believe he hired someone to look in the first year. A man came through redemption asking questions at the hotel, but I wasn't at the hotel. I was invisible." She paused. "I've had no indication anyone has looked since. But Cross could find out what you told me if he went looking." "He would need someone in St. Louis," she said. "Which is possible. Men of a certain kind of money know other men of a certain kind of money." "How long ago did all this happen?" 7 years. Theodore Holt is probably married to someone else by now." She said this flatly, the way she had trained herself to say things that were not flat inside her. "The money is not a significant amount to a man of his means. The risk of pursuing me publicly would be greater than the benefit of recovering it." "But you've been afraid anyway," Edgar said. She turned to look at him. He was looking out at the grass. "Yes," she said, "because fear like that doesn't stop being useful just because the danger recedes," he said. "It becomes a habit, and then it becomes a way of living." She sat with that for a very long time. Long enough that the sun shifted and the shadow of the porch roof moved across the boards at their feet. "How do you know that?" she asked. He looked at her. "Because I understand something about it," he said. And he did not say anything about Clara, and she did not ask. But it was there between them like a piece of furniture they both needed to acknowledge was there before either of them could comfortably move around it. Harlan Cross did not find a St. Louis connection quickly enough to be useful. Sheriff Griggs, armed with the statement that Gideon Marsh had provided to his Wichita attorney, and then, facing the specific pressure of a federal cattle fraud inquiry, to a county deputy in Sedgwick County, filed charges against both Marsh and Cross in the first week of November. Cross hired a Wichita lawyer of great expense and limited integrity. The trial, which took place at the Comanche County Courthouse in December, was attended by approximately every person in redemption who could find a seat and several who were technically too young to understand the proceedings, but came anyway for the atmosphere. Marcella testified. She did not want to, not because she feared the content of her testimony, but because testifying required being publicly visible in a way she had spent 3 years avoiding. But she sat in the witness chair in the county courthouse, and she explained her findings in the 3-bar accounts with a clarity that the judge later described, in an unusual departure from judicial formality, as the most organized presentation of evidence this court has received in 8 years of sitting. Harlan Cross's expensive Wichita lawyer attempted 3 different lines of attack on her credibility, and abandoned all 3 when it became apparent she could answer every question about the accounting with a precision that made him look bad. Cross was found guilty of conspiracy to defraud and sentenced to 2 years in the state penitentiary plus restitution. Marsh received 3 years and was stripped of his brand registration in Kansas. Outside the courthouse in the cold December air, with Redemption's inhabitants streaming past in the general atmosphere of settled justice that small towns generate after a good verdict, Edgar Fletcher found Marcella standing by herself near the courthouse steps. "You were extraordinary in there," he said. "I was accurate," she said. "Yes," he said. That's what was extraordinary. She looked at him. He was standing closer than he usually stood, or perhaps it was that she had moved closer. She was not entirely sure which. And the cold air was sharp, and the sky was that hard winter blue, and something had changed in the preceding 2 months in ways she had been cataloging with the helpless precision of a bookkeeper who cannot stop doing arithmetic even when she would prefer not to. "I should tell you something," she said. "All right. I have been deliberately invisible in this town for 3 years," she said. "I have been very careful and very deliberate about it. And then you looked at me on Caldwell Street in August and smiled, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it since." He was very still for a moment. "You ran away from me," he said. "Yes, I noticed. I imagine you did. I've been trying not to push," he said. "I knew you were frightened of something. I didn't know what, and I thought the most useful thing I could do was not add to it. That was," she said carefully, "one of the more considerate things anyone has done for me." "Marcella," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it the way you feel a key turning in a lock you had forgotten still worked. "Edgar," she said, which was also the first time. They stood in the cold December air outside the courthouse in Redemption, Kansas, in 1881, and he reached out and took her hand in both of his with the careful, deliberate quality of a man who was not going to rush anything, and she let him, which was itself the most significant thing she had done in 3 years. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if that's something you would permit." She thought about proper courtship, about all the things it implied in 1881 in a small town in Kansas, about visibility and permanence and the terrifying, specific vulnerability of being known. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would permit it." He smiled. That smile, the one from Caldwell Street in August, the one that had cracked 3 years of careful invisibility in a single moment. Up close and in the cold December light, it was still the most disarming thing she had ever encountered. "Good," he said. Proper courtship in Redemption in the winter of 1881 meant Sunday drives in the wagon after church, which Edgar had begun attending with more regularity since August, in a development that Reverend Stoddard noted from the pulpit with visible satisfaction. It meant dinners at the Fletcher Ranch house with Rosa and Pete Ochoa present as a combination of household and chaperone. Dinners during which Pete said very little and watched everything, and occasionally permitted himself a small nod of private approval that Marcella, who missed nothing, saw and filed away with the warmth that she had not yet admitted she allowed herself to feel. It meant evenings at the Redemption Literary Society, which met on Wednesday nights in the back room of the public library, and consisted of 9 people reading aloud from books and periodicals, and arguing about them with the friendly vehemence of people who lived far from cities, and had decided that ideas were an available substitute for proximity to culture. Edgar was already a member. Marcella joined in January, the first time she had voluntarily inserted herself into any Redemption institution, and she found to her astonishment that she liked it. She argued about a serialized novel in Harper's Weekly with a schoolteacher named Mrs. Beaumont for 40 minutes one evening and went home feeling more like herself than she had in years. She was becoming visible, deliberately visible this time, which was entirely different from being found. In February, on a Sunday afternoon when the wagon was stopped at the top of a long rise that showed the whole of the Cimarron Valley below them in its winter brown and gray, Edgar said, with the same directness that characterized everything he did, "I have been thinking about asking you to marry me." Marcella looked at the valley. "You are thinking about it," she repeated. "I am telling you I'm thinking about it," he said, "because I don't want to ask until I'm certain you would say yes, and I'm not certain yet." She looked at him. He was looking at her with the patient, steady quality she had catalogued over the preceding 6 months, that quality of a man who understood that some things had to be approached the way you approach a field of new grass in spring, carefully, without forcing the pace. "Why aren't you certain?" she asked. "Because I think you're still deciding whether you can afford to trust this much," he said, and I don't want to put you in a position where you feel pressured to answer before you're ready." She sat with this for a very long time. Long enough that a hawk moved in a slow circle above the valley and descended again out of sight. "I told you the worst of my past," she said. "You did. And you told me about Clara." He had, in December, on a cold night when they had stayed on the porch too late talking, and the cold had finally driven them inside. He had told her about Clara with the quiet, honest grief of a man who had finished the acute stage of mourning and arrived somewhere more sustainable. He had told her that he had loved Clara deeply and that her death had left him with a specific fear that things he valued would be taken from him, and that this fear had been one of the reasons he had been patient about approaching Marcella rather than pushing. He had been afraid of wanting her too much before he knew whether she was safe to want. She had understood that in her bones. "I am still afraid sometimes," she said now, looking at the valley. "Not of Theodore Holt. Of the general condition of trusting someone." "I know," he said, "but I think," she said, "that I have been more afraid of remaining invisible than I have been willing to admit. And I think the reason I've spent the last 6 months wearing color more often and arguing with Mrs. Beaumont at the Literary Society and riding out here on Sundays is that I have been, without entirely meaning to, becoming real again." "You were always real," he said. "You just stopped letting anyone see it." She looked at him. "Ask me," she said. "I'm not certain you're ready," he said. "Edgar Fletcher," she said, with a precision that made him blink, "I have reorganized 17 years of your accounting records, testified in your defense before a county judge, and spent 6 months being courted by you with a patience and consideration that is honestly somewhat bewildering to a woman of my history. I am as ready as I am going to be. Ask me." The corners of his mouth moved. That smile building slowly and then arriving with the full warmth that had unmade her on Caldwell Street in August. "Marcella Carter," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, "I will." He reached across the wagon seat and touched her face, gently, with the back of his hand, the way you touch something you have been afraid of losing before you had it. And Marcella Carter, who had spent 7 years being afraid of being found, and 3 of them being invisible, and all of them carrying the weight of a secret that had kept her from belonging anywhere, leaned into that touch and felt something she had almost forgotten the name of. Safe. They were married in March of 1882 at the Redemption Church, in a ceremony that Reverend Stoddard described afterward as one of the finest he had performed in 20 years of ministry, not because of its extravagance, but because of the quality of attention the two people at the front of the church paid to each other. Marcella wore a dress that Rosa Ochoa helped her make from a deep blue wool she had ordered from the mercantile, a color she had chosen with the specific awareness that blue was the furthest possible thing from brown calico. She carried prairie flowers that had no business blooming yet in March, but had been coaxed early by a week of unusual warmth. Edgar wore a clean coat and his least battered hat, and looked at her when she came down the aisle with an expression that Samuel Howell, sitting in the 5th pew, later told his wife was the most direct piece of emotion he had witnessed on a grown man in years. Pete Ochoa did not cry, but his eyes were very bright. Rosa Ochoa cried enthusiastically on his behalf. They held the reception at the 3 Bar, where Rosa had cooked enough food for twice the number of people present, which in a small town was never actually a problem, because twice the people always seemed to materialize. The Literary Society came in full force. Mrs. Beaumont gave a toast that was both eloquent and slightly argumentative in the way of everything she did. Deputy Greer came with his wife and their 3 children. Even Samuel Howell came, looking slightly bewildered, as he always did, by events that fell outside the categories of goods and accounts. Marcella danced, which was something she had not done in years, and she was not elegant about it in the drawing-room style of St. Louis. But she was certain and she was present, and she laughed twice, real laughter which startled her both times. That night in the limestone house with the wide windows that looked at the sky, She lay awake for a long time in the new reality of her own life and felt the silence of the 3 bar around her, the dark, enormous, specific silence of the Kansas grasslands at night, which was not the silence of absence but the silence of space, of room, of being somewhere large enough to breathe. She was not invisible anymore. She was here. She was known. She was, for the first time in a very long time, in the place she was meant to be. She reached for Edgar's hand in the dark, and he took it without waking, the warm, certain grip of a man who had been looking for something for a long time and had learned to hold it with both care and confidence once he found it. She thought, before she fell asleep, of Caldwell Street in August, of the dust and the gunshot and the crowd scattering, and of the moment the dust cleared and he had looked up from across the street and smiled. She had run from that smile. She had been afraid of it for 6 weeks and cautious of it for 6 months. She had argued with it internally and catalogued its dangers and tried, with all the considerable analytical force of her particular mind, to find the catch in it. There had been no catch. There had been, simply, a man who had finally seen her, and a woman who had finally let him. Spring came to Comanche County with its usual extravagance, the grass coming up green and fast after the long brown winter, the Cimarron running full and clear, the cattle moving out to the far pastures in that restless, energetic way they had in the first warm weeks. Marcella threw herself into the business of the 3 bar with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. And it turned out that the skills of a woman who had spent 7 years making herself invisible and surviving on her own considerable competence translated with remarkable efficiency into the business of running a ranch. She redesigned the accounting system from the ground up, built on a structure that was logical rather than historically accumulated, and implemented it with the help of a young man from Redemption named Thomas Greer, the deputy's eldest son, who had a gift for figures and whom she had decided could be trained into a useful assistant. Thomas was 17 and deeply serious, and called her Mrs. Fletcher, with such careful formality that it occasionally made her bite the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. She began to keep a correspondence with her sister in St. Louis, not with her father, who had written her one letter in the 3rd year of her absence, a letter so comprehensively focused on his own grievances that it had told her nothing about whether she was missed and everything about whether she needed to reply. Her sister was a leaner, 4 years older, who had stayed in St. Louis and married a decent man who owned a printing business, and who wrote back to Marcella's letter in June of 1882 with an outpouring of relief and reproach and love in such equal measures that it took 3 pages to contain and ended with the question, "Are you happy? You sound happy. I never thought I would write those words to you. Are you really happy?" Marcella wrote back. "Yes, I am really happy. I am sorry it took this long to be able to say it." In the summer of 1882, she found out she was carrying a child. She told Edgar on a July morning when they were both in the barn looking at a situation involving a mare that had refused to go into her stall for 3 days, which was a problem that had been occupying a disproportionate amount of Edgar's attention. She stood beside him, watching the mare look back at them with an expression of thoroughgoing obstinacy, and she said, without particular preamble, "I believe I am expecting." Edgar turned from the mare and looked at her, and the quality of what moved across his face was something she had not seen there before. It was the specific, transparent joy of a man who has spent a long time living carefully and has just been given something he had not dared to want too loudly. "Are you certain?" he asked. "I have been paying attention to my own body for 31 years, she said. "I am fairly certain." He laughed. She had made him laugh many times in the preceding months, more than she had expected to, more than she had expected herself to enjoy. But this was a laugh of a different quality, warmer, less contained, the laugh of a man who had let his guard down completely. He kissed her there in the barn, which was thoroughly unobserved except by the obstinate mare, who watched with an air of species-wide indifference. The baby was born in February of 1883, attended by the redemption doctor, a brisk and capable man named Dr. Keene, and by Rosa Ochoa, who had taken up a position in the corner of the bedroom that communicated clearly she would be there until the situation was resolved to her satisfaction, and that no one should suggest otherwise. It was a long night. The Kansas winter came down hard outside the limestone walls, and the wind found the gaps around the window frames, and the lamp burned steadily on the bedside table. The child was a boy. Edgar's son, dark-eyed and loud about his arrival, with a quantity of black hair and an expression of emphatic dissatisfaction with the world that Marcella, looking at him for the first time, recognized immediately. "He looks like he's calculating something," Edgar said, from where he was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the baby in Marcella's arms with the transparent, luminous expression of a man entirely at the mercy of a feeling. "He looks," Rosa said from the corner, "like he is already running the accounts." They named him William James Fletcher, after Edgar's father and Marcella's maternal grandfather, and called him Will, and he had his mother's eyes and his father's constitution, and from the very beginning the specific, clear-headed quality of attention that meant he had inherited, in some form from both sides, the habit of missing nothing. The three-bar grew in the years that followed. Edgar made 2 additional land purchases along the creek line, adding 3,000 acres to the ranch, and improving its water rights in a way that had always been the ranch's most significant strategic vulnerability. Marcella, who had sat in on every negotiation with the same quiet, precise attention she brought to the accounts, had been the one to point out in the first purchase that the seller's title to a small eastern section was technically unclear, and that a cleaner deal could be made by excluding it, advice that had saved them from a boundary dispute that would have run for years. After that, Edgar brought her into every significant business conversation, not with announcement or formality, but simply because it was the practical thing to do, and he was a practical man. They had another child in 1885, a daughter they named Clara Rosa, the first name for Edgar's first wife, chosen with the care and honesty of people who acknowledge their histories rather than burying them, and the second for Rosa Ochoa, who received this news at the kitchen table and did not cry but sat very quietly for several minutes with her hand over her mouth. Clara Rosa was, from the beginning, the precise temperament opposite of her brother. Where Will was deliberate and watchful, Clara was bold and fast, the kind of child who decided to do a thing and was already halfway through doing it before she had finished deciding, who fell off the corral fence at age 4, got up immediately, and climbed back up before anyone could think to stop her. Pete Ochoa, who had watched over both children with a patient, quiet devotion that he expressed entirely in practical acts rather than stated emotion, was heard to remark, on the occasion of Clara's third attempt to ride a horse that was twice her size, that she was more than enough for any county. Redemption in the 1880s was a town in motion. The railroad extended a spur line to Comanche County in 1884, and with the railroad came new people, new commerce, and the particular social complexity of a frontier town transitioning toward something more settled and more complicated. There were conflicts that Marcella watched with the vigilance of someone who understood that progress in one direction did not automatically mean progress in all directions. She saw, on the street and in the store, and in the attitudes of men who came in from the east, the ongoing and deliberate diminishment of the Apache and Osage communities that had their own complex and often unjust relationship with the settled frontier. She wrote letters to her sister about it. She said things about it to Edgar that he listened to carefully and took seriously, because he was a man who understood that owning 11,000 acres of Kansas grassland came with a particular obligation to think clearly about who had been displaced so he could own it, and what was owed in consequence. These were not simple conversations. They were honest ones, and honesty about the history of a place was, Marcella had come to believe, the minimum required for people of conscience living in it. Thomas Greer became, in 1886, the Three Bars full-time account manager at a salary that reflected both his genuine skill and the years Marcella had invested in his training. He was 21 by then, a composed and capable young man who still called her Mrs. Fletcher with great formality, and he ran the accounts with a system she had built and could now largely leave to him, which freed her for other things. She had begun teaching bookkeeping and basic mathematics to women in redemption, at first informally, then in a weekly session she held at the library on Friday mornings, that started with 3 participants and had grown by 1887 to 14, a fact that Mrs. Beaumont of the Literary Society had noted in the Redemption Courier with the specific pride of a woman who recognized that education was a form of survival. One afternoon in the summer of 1887, a letter arrived from St. Louis. It was not from a leaner. It was from a man named Robert Sayers, who identified himself as an attorney, and who informed Marcella that one Theodore Holt had died in January of that year of a cardiac event, leaving an estate of moderate size and a second wife who was, according to the letter, pursuing probate through the St. Louis courts. The attorney, who had been engaged by that second wife to investigate outstanding matters from Holt's estate, had come across the record of a missing sum and Marcella's name attached to it in a way that was, he wrote with scrupulous care, more suggestive of a civil than a criminal matter. Marcella sat with the letter for a long time at the desk in the office, at the desk where she had first opened Edgar's chaotic ledgers 6 years ago, and first allowed herself to be seen by someone she was not certain she could trust. Theodore Holt was dead. The secret that had kept her invisible for 3 years and careful for 7 was a civil matter, suggestive, in the hands of an attorney who seemed, from the tone of his letter, to be interested primarily in closing an estate efficiently rather than prosecuting old grievances. She wrote back to Robert Sayers the same day, in the direct and thorough manner she brought to correspondence. She acknowledged the sum. She offered restitution with interest calculated at the standard rate from 1878, which she determined would amount to $412. She noted without editorializing that she had taken the sum in the specific belief that her life had been at risk and that she had had no legal recourse, and that she was prepared to resolve the matter cleanly if the estate was prepared to do the same. She showed the letter to Edgar before she sent it. He read it, then looked at her. $412, he said, with 7 years' interest at standard rate. You don't owe interest, he said. You took it to save your life. I know that, she said, but I would rather resolve it completely than leave any thread unsettled. He studied her for a moment. This is about putting the past away, he said, not a question. Yes, she said. He nodded. He handed the letter back. Then send it, he said. Robert Sayers wrote back in September accepting her offer. The $412 was paid, the matter was closed, and the specific, constant, quiet fear she had carried since a February night in 1878 when she boarded a westbound train with 30 cents and a forged letter, and a secret she could not share with anyone finally, at last, stopped being a weight she carried. She told Edgar that night, sitting on the porch in the September evening with the warm air moving across the grass, and Will, 4 years old, already asleep inside, and Clara, too, making her last determined bid for continued consciousness in Rose's arms inside the house. It's done, she said. How does that feel, he asked. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about things that mattered. Like I have been carrying a stone in my pocket for 9 years, she said, and I have set it down. And I am not entirely certain how to walk without the weight of it, but I believe I will figure it out. He reached over and took her hand. She looked at him in the September evening light, this man who had smiled at her on a dusty street in August of 1881 and cracked her careful invisibility like a fault line in glass. This man who had waited, with the patient steadiness of someone who understood that trust could not be forced, while she decided whether she could afford to trust him. This man who had listened to the worst of her past without judgment and loved her with the same thorough, practical, genuine quality he brought to everything else in his life. "I have a confession to make," she said. He looked at her with mild alarm. "After 9 years. After 9 years," she confirmed. "When you smiled at me on Caldwell Street." "When I ran. I remember," he said. "I went home that night," she said, "and I added Samuel Howell's accounts wrong 4 times in a row, which I had never done before in my professional career." He looked at her. "I know," she said. "The professional damage alone should have told me something." He laughed and she laughed, and somewhere inside the house, Clara Rosa said something demanding and Rosa responded with patient affection. And the September evening went on in all its warm, ordinary, irreplaceable abundance. The autumn of 1887 brought a second letter from Alina, this time with the news that she and her husband would be visiting Redemption in October. A piece of information that sent Marcella into the particular kind of focused, slightly frantic preparation that characterized her relationship to events she was emotionally invested in but could not entirely control. She remade the curtains in the guest room and interrogated Rosa about the dinner menu with a thoroughness that Rosa bore with remarkable good humor. "She is your sister," Rosa said, "not the governor." "She is the only member of my family I have seen in 9 years, Marcella said. "It is not the same category." Alina arrived on the 3rd Tuesday of October on the railroad spur, accompanied by her husband Henry, who was a pleasant, bookish man who seemed slightly overwhelmed by the scale of Kansas, and by their 2 children, who were 8 and 10, and immediately and enthusiastically adopted by Will and Clara Rosa as new members of their operational unit. Alina and Marcella stood on the platform at the Redemption Depot for a long moment before either of them spoke. Alina was 4 years older and still carried the specific quality of authority that eldest sisters maintained regardless of subsequent life events. She looked at Marcella with eyes that were the same dark shade as Marcella's own and did the specific kind of looking that means a person is reading the full text of 9 years rather than just the surface of a face. "You look different," she said finally. "I'm 9 years older," Marcella said. "No," Alina said. "You look like yourself. You used to not look like yourself. I didn't realize the difference until just now." Marcella stood on the depot platform in the October light and felt the specific, complicated emotion of someone who had been known by someone else since before she knew herself, and who was being seen by that person, accurately, after a very long time. "Come and meet my husband," she said. They spent a week that Marcella would remember for the rest of her life with a quality of particular brightness. Alina was funny in the way of people who have survived difficulty with their humor intact, sharp and affectionate in equal measure, and she adored Edgar with a transparency that she made absolutely no attempt to conceal, informing him on the 3rd day of the visit that he was considerably better than anything Marcella described in her letters, which I will attribute to her habitual understatement rather than any deficiency in her observation. Edgar bore this assessment with the quiet amusement of a man who had married someone who described things with meticulous accuracy and had consequently learned to trust the precision of understatement. The children ran in a pack for the entire week. Will, who normally carried a certain reservation with new people, had decided that Alina's son James was a person worth knowing, and had proceeded to take him on a comprehensive tour of the 3 bars' operations with the same thorough quality his mother brought to accounting. Clara Rosa and Alina's daughter Margaret had been inseparable since approximately the 1st hour, and had collectively decided, by the 2nd day, that they were organizing a performance of some theatrical nature that required everyone's participation and would be held on Friday evening. The performance was held. It featured a plot that was difficult to follow, but involved a great deal of movement and several speeches delivered with complete conviction. It received an enthusiastic standing ovation from its audience of 6 adults, which Marcella reflected was the appropriate response to anyone who threw their full self into something they believed in. Alina left on a Sunday morning in the October sun with the railroad spur taking her and Henry and the children east toward St. Louis, and she hugged Marcella on the platform in the way of someone who intends to not wait another 9 years. "Write more often," she said. "I will," Marcella said. "And I want to meet this new one," Alina said, and patted Marcella's midsection with the knowing air of an older sister. Marcella, who had not yet told anyone except Edgar, stared at her. "You have the same look you had in 1882, Alina said. "I know the look." The train pulled away, and Marcella watched it go, and Edgar stood beside her with Will on his shoulders and Clara Rosa hanging off his arm, and she thought, in the October morning, about what it meant to belong to a place and to people and to yourself, all at the same time. The third child was a boy. They named him Daniel Henry Fletcher, the first name simply because they both liked it, the second for Alina's husband, which made Alina write back a letter of approximately 7 pages in length. Daniel arrived in the spring of 1888, more peaceable in his introduction to the world than either of his older siblings had been, with his father's brown hair and an expression of calm interest that Rosa observed from her corner, was already deciding what it thought about everything. By 1889, the 3 Bar was one of the most efficiently managed cattle operations in Comanche County. This was due in part to the acreage and the water rights and the quality of the herd, all of which Edgar had built with careful attention over the years. But it was also, as anyone who knew the operation well would confirm, due to the accounting systems, the quarterly analysis, and the purchasing negotiations that had transformed it from a profitable but chaotic enterprise into something genuinely sustainable. Thomas Greer had grown into a first-rate manager. Pete Ochoa, who had turned 60 in 1888, was still working the horses with the same unhurried competence, and had developed a relationship with Will that Marcella watched with quiet gratitude, the boy learning from the older man the specific language of horses and patience that no classroom could teach. Redemption had grown. It was not quite a city, not by any definition the East Coast would use, but it was a town with a brick courthouse and a 2-story hotel, and a newspaper that printed 3 days a week and a school that had expanded to include a secondary class. Marcella had been involved in the school expansion through the same pragmatic route she had taken with most civic things. She had seen the problem clearly, said so directly to the people who needed to hear it, and applied her organizational skills to the solution without waiting to be formally invited. She was, by 1889, a visible person in redemption. Genuinely, organically, completely visible, known by people from the Literary Society and the Women's Mathematics class and the County School Board and the 3 Bar Ranch, known as Edgar Fletcher's wife and as Marcella Carter Fletcher, which was the name she had given herself when she signed the County School Board minutes. The first 2 names kept deliberately intact because she had carried them through 7 years of fear and 3 years of invisibility, and they belonged to her. She was 32 years old. She had 3 children and 11,000 acres, and a life that had been built, with considerable difficulty and some assistance, from the raw materials of a runaway bookkeeper's daughter's nerve and intelligence, and the specific grace of having been seen at the right moment by the right person. On a Sunday afternoon in August of 1889, exactly 8 years to the month from the afternoon on Caldwell Street when the dusk cleared, and a tall man across the street had looked up from his bay horse and smiled. Marcella was sitting on the porch of the limestone house with a book she was not reading, watching Will and Clara Rosa and Daniel in the long view of the summer grass, running in the way children run when they have enough space and enough certainty, entirely unself-consciously. Edgar came out from the house and sat in the chair beside her, the same 2 chairs they had been sitting in for 7 years, and he looked out at the children and then at her with the same quality of attention, that specific, warm, completely voluntary attention that had unmade her on Caldwell Street in 1881. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She thought about it. "About Caldwell Street," she said. "About what I looked like from your side of the street." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to know what I saw?" "Yes." "I saw a woman walking very carefully," he said. "Too carefully. The kind of careful that means someone has had reasons to be careful, and I thought there is something there. Something being hidden." And he paused with the slight difficulty of a man articulating an internal thing he does not often articulate. "I wanted very much to be someone it could be shown to." She sat with that. "You smiled," she said. "I smiled," he agreed. "I ran." "You ran," he agreed. "And then 6 weeks later you rode out here and opened my ledger books and found a conspiracy I didn't know I had. And then you told me your worst secret on my porch in October. And then you argued with me about interest rates for 45 minutes before you agreed to marry me." "I did not argue about interest rates," she said. "You absolutely argued about interest rates," he said. "I was making a principled point about the financial logistics of a joint household," she said. He smiled. That smile, the one that had started everything. "Marcella," he said. "Edgar," she said. "Are you happy?" he asked. The same question Alina had asked in a letter from St. Louis 7 years ago. "Are you really happy?" She looked at the children in the grass, at the long golden-green view of 3 Bar Land, at the sky above Comanche County that was the specific, saturated blue of August in Kansas, enormous and clear and full of light. She thought of the February night she had boarded a westbound train with 30 cents and a forged letter, and the desperate, necessary courage of someone who has decided that the life they have been given is not acceptable, and that whatever is on the other side of running has to be better. She thought of 3 years of brown calico and downcast eyes and numbers balanced perfectly for a man who hardly noticed she was there. She thought of a gunshot on Caldwell Street and the dust clearing and a man across the road looking up. "Yes," she said, "I am really happy." She reached over the way she had that first night as his wife and took his hand. He held it with the same warm, certain grip. The grass moved in its visible wave. The children ran in the enormous August light. The stone was long since put down. The secret was long since resolved. The invisibility was long since over. She was here. She was known. She was home. And in the summer of 1890, when Will Fletcher was 7 and Clara Rosa was 5 and Daniel was 2, and the household was operating at a level of organized chaos that even Marcella's considerable systems management could only partially contain, she found out she was expecting once more. And she told Edgar on the same porch in the same chairs in the evening light, and he looked at her with the same luminous, transparent joy, and she said, "I have already decided that if it is a girl we are naming her after Rosa. And if it is a boy," he said, "we will discuss it," she said. "Like the interest rates," he said. "Exactly like the interest rates," she said. It was a boy. They discussed it for 3 weeks with considerable engagement, and they named him Thomas Peter Fletcher. Thomas for the young account manager who had become, over 8 years, a genuine member of their extended family, and Peter for Pete Ochoa, who received this news at the round pen fence where he was working a young horse and stood very still for a moment, and then said with great dignity, "That is a good name for a Fletcher." It was a good name. All their names were good names, for good, loud, warm-blooded, clear-eyed children who ran in the grass and argued at dinner and grew up knowing who they were and where they came from and why both of those things mattered. Marcella Carter Fletcher kept her accounts for 30 more years. She trained 11 women in redemption in bookkeeping and mathematics, 2 of whom went on to run their own businesses, a fact she noted in her private journal with a satisfaction she did not bother to understate. She argued with Mrs. Beaumont at the Literary Society until Mrs. Beaumont died in 1901 and was replaced by her daughter, with whom Marcella argued with equal enthusiasm. She wrote to Alina every month without fail and saw her every few years, and loved her with the particular love of people who know each other at the cellular level and have chosen each other across the distance of separate lives. She and Edgar grew old together in the limestone house with the wide windows and the long porch facing southeast, in the way that people grow old when they have done the work of knowing each other honestly, and have found in that knowledge not disappointment, but an expanding rather than a diminishing thing. They argued sometimes, because they were both people of specific and strongly held positions, and they made up with the same directness they brought to the arguments, and neither of them kept score because both of them had learned, through different roads and at different costs, that keeping score was the enemy of everything that mattered. On an August morning in 1921, 40 years to the month from the afternoon on Caldwell Street, Marcella sat on the porch of the three-bar house and watched the Kansas grass move in the wind. She was 64 years old. Edgar was 62. Will was 38 and running the north section of the ranch with his wife and their 4 children. Clara Rosa was 36 and living in Wichita, where she had married a doctor and was raising 2 sons with the same bold, fast energy she had brought to everything since she had first climbed a 2-big horse at age 4. Daniel was 33 and had taken over Thomas Greer's accounting operation, which had grown with the town into something that employed 4 people. Thomas Peter, they called him Tommy, was 31 and still had the same calm, interested expression he had been born with, and was working as a surveyor for the railroad, which Edgar considered somewhat ironic given everything. The ranch was still there. The accounts still balanced. The accounts had balanced with consistent precision for 39 years. Edgar came out from the house and sat in his chair and looked out at the grass with her. They were quiet for a while in the way of people who have been quiet together long enough that it is not emptiness but its own kind of fullness. "August again," he said. "August again," she said. "Do you remember," he said, "the first time I came into Howell's store? I remember that you brought coffee," she said, "and that I did not look up for 40 minutes because I was hoping you would go away." "And did that work?" he said. "Manifestly not," she said. He reached over and took her hand. 62 years old and still the same hand, warm and certain and unhurried. She looked out at the 3-bar grass, moving in its visible wave in the August morning, golden and green by turns. She thought of the Caldwell Street gunshot and the clearing dust and the smile from across the road. She thought of the woman who had run from that smile, certain that being seen was the most dangerous thing in the world. That woman had been wrong. Being seen, she had learned, was not the dangerous thing. Being seen was the only thing. And she had been seen for 40 years by the man beside her, and she had seen him, and in the seeing they had built this. A house, a life, 4 children who had grown into people worth knowing, a ranch that would outlast them both, a town they had helped to shape, and a love that was not dramatic in the way of young loves, not anymore, not for a long time, but was instead something better and more honest than drama, something solid and alive and specific. The love of 2 people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and continued to choose each other, every day, across 40 years of ordinary and extraordinary mornings. In the enormous, irreducible light of a Kansas August that went on, gold and blue and true, all the way to the horizon,